Welcome back. In this step, what we want to do is we would want to start moving the state out from the counter button to the counter class. Before we move this state out, let's start with initializing the state in the counter. So all that we need to do is define a constructor. So basically I'm copying the code from counter button into counter to define the initial state of the counter. So this dot state counter is 0. That's cool. Now what we would want is we would want the increment method also to be present in here, right? So let's move the increment method also. So I've copied the increment method as well. Let's not really worry about the comments which are present in here. These are all things which we are familiar with right now. So that should not worry us. This dot set states. One thing is we need to worry about how this props by would come to us. Let's comment that out for now. And since we added the increment method, what I would do is actually do increment.bind. Okay, so basically what we have is a constructor where we are calling the super, and we have this dot state, and we have counter initialized to 0. We are binding the increment method, and in the increment method, let's not really worry about all this right now. Control slash or command slash to comment this, and for now let's just log increment from parent. One of the things you can observe is the fact that now there is a parent-child relationship between the counter and the counter button classes. The counter button has a state representing the state at that specific counter. The counter has a state representing the total count. What we want to do now is in the increment method inside the counter button. So inside the counter button, inside the increment, what we want to be able to do is we would want to be able to call the increment method in the counter class. So from counter button increment, I would also want to be able to increment the counter increment. How can I do that? How can I call a parent method from a child component? The only way you can do that is by actually passing in the method as a property to the child component. So from the parent component, we are saying increment method is equal to this dot increment. One of the important things is this is not, I'm not calling the increment method, right? Remember the last time we had a problem? What would happen if we do this? Let's see. So I'm actually copying the increment method again 3 times. So I'm passing in the increment method to the each of the child components as a property. Let's see what would happen. Right click, inspect, and go to console. So you can see that increment from parent was called thrice already. I have not really clicked any of this, but still the increment from parent is automatically called. This is because I'm calling this method. Actually what we need to do is we need to pass a reference. So this dot increment. So we just need to define a reference. Where do we need to call it? We need to call it in the increment method. How do we call it in the increment method? Increment this dot props dot increment method. So what we are trying to do is from the props of this counter button. So in the counter button, so we are inside the counter button class right now. Inside the counter button, what we are saying is from the props which are passed in, get the increment method. Let's see what would happen now. You can see that the increment from parent is getting called whenever I click this specific thing. One of the things that we would want to be able to pass to this specific method is how much to increment by. How can I pass that? I can pass this dot props dot by. And what can the parent method do? It can use that, right? This dot props dot by. Nope, actually I would just call it by. So I'm passing a parameter called by, and I would want to use it in here. So I would want to be able to say this, the value of this is by. Will I be able to do this? If I'm using double quotes, no. But if I'm using ticks, yes. Tick is the character which appears like a single quote, but it's on the left hand top corner of your keyboard. Tick. So if you use tick, the value of the variables get replaced. So if I do a +1, you can see increment from parent 1, increment from parent with a value 5, increment from parent with a value 10. Isn't that cool? Actually, I should have called this increment from child or increment in parent, whatever. So now what we want to do is we would want to set the state as well, right? We want to show the state. That's the reason why we are doing all this stuff. So what should be the state be? This dot set state, what should it be? This dot state dot counter plus by. How much should it be incremented by? Let's comment out the thing. The other thing which I would want to add in here is the span. So I'll copy the span from below because we are exactly using the same kind of stuff. So let's save this, and we have +1, +5, +10. Isn't that cool? That's awesome, right? So now we have a single state at the bottom, and we have now all the buttons which are present in here, and each buttons have individual state as well as the counter has its own state. In this step, we started with defining a state for the counter, and then we found that from the increment method, we needed to call the increment method which is defined inside the parent. And the way we did that was when we were defining the child components, we added in a property. So for each of the child components, we sent in a property saying which method needs to be called when increment is done. And using that, we updated the state of the parent. I would recommend you to revise what we have done in this step again. Think about it and repeat this before we move on to the next example. I think this is one of the fundamental concepts of Reacts. What we are doing in here is moving the state from the child to the parent. One of the important things to understand is now I don't need to really store the state at a child level. I only need to store the state at the parent level, because these individual counters are useless unless you have additional requirements which needs these. As of the current requirement, we don't really need these stuff. All that we need is the parent state, and that's sufficient for us. So I can even go ahead and say I'll remove this out completely, and still the component will function well. Right, this is the counter that we wanted. One of the interesting things is how do you comment out stuff from JSX, right? Until now I have been removing stuff from JSX. The way you can comment stuff from JSX is actually put them between /* and // and actually make it JavaScript code. So this is a tricky thing actually. Commenting out code from JSX is not easy. Now you can see that this does not come up. So first thing is the typical multi-line comment, and you put that as a JavaScript code, and that's how you comment out stuff in JSX. Isn't that interesting? Okay, now I was deviating from the topic a little bit down there, but the important thing is we learned how to move this state up. I'll see you in the next step.